Hey everybody, this is Deb with Truthification Chronicles, and today I'm going to talk about one of my favorite people in the Trump administration, and that would be Mike Pompeo. Yes, our Secretary of State had a speech today. Well, I'm recording this on Saturday night. So, yes, today he had a speech for all the governors in the United States. And he needed to talk to them about China. Now, that might seem strange to talk to governors about China, but it's not. And you'll find out why in just a minute. This is the actual speech. It's really not very long. It's about 20 minutes long. And especially when he gets in the middle of it here, about 12 minutes in, very important stuff that he's talking about, because what he's dealing with is how China is infiltrating not the upper levels necessarily of our government, but how they are actually making an influence on our middle America, the middle of the road type things, and especially in our education system.
The Chinese government has been methodical in the way it's analyzed our system, our very open system, one that we're deeply proud of. It's assessed our vulnerabilities, and it's decided to exploit our freedoms to gain advantage over us at the federal level, the state level, and the local level. Last year, I announced that I would give a series of speeches on China, and this is part of that. It's the context in which state and local government officials ought to think about the way they lead with respect to our relationship. It's important. China matters. It's been part of my mission at the State Department to mobilize all parts of the United States government. I was out in Silicon Valley a couple of weeks ago to talk to America's leading tech companies about this very set of issues, and I need your help too. What China does in Topeka and Sacramento reverberates in Washington and Beijing and far beyond. Competition with China is happening. It's happening in your state. In fact, I'd be surprised if most of you in the audience have not been lobbied by the Chinese Communist Party directly. Chinese Communist Party friendship organizations like the one that I referenced earlier are in Richmond, Minneapolis, Portland, Jupiter, Florida, and many other cities around the country. But sometimes China's activities aren't quite that public, and I want to talk about some of that today. Let me read you an excerpt of a letter from a Chinese diplomat. It was China's consul general in New York, sent a letter last month to the speaker of one of your state legislatures. Here's what the letter said in part. It said, quote, "As we all know, Taiwan is part of China. Avoid engaging in any official contact with Taiwan, including sending congratulatory messages to the electeds, introducing bills and proclamations for the election, sending officials and representatives to attend the inauguration ceremony, and inviting officials in Taiwan to visit the United States." End of quote from the letter. Think about that. You add a diplomat from China assigned here to the United States, a representative of the Chinese Communist Party in the New York City, sending an official letter urging that an American elected official shouldn't exercise his right to freedom of speech. Let that sink in for just a minute. And this isn't a one-off event. It's happening all across the country. Chinese consulates in New York, in Illinois, in Texas, and two in California, bound by the diplomatic responsibilities and rights of the Vienna Convention, are very politically active at the state level, as is the embassy right here in Washington, D.C. Maybe some of you have heard about the time when the Chinese consulate paid the UC San Diego students to protest the Dalai Lama. Or last August, when a former governor, Phil Bryant of Mississippi, received a letter from a diplomat in the council's office in Houston threatening to cancel a Chinese investment if the governor chose to travel to Taiwan. Phil went anyway. Last year, a high school in Chicago disinvited a Taiwanese representative to serve on a climate panel after Chinese pressure. You know, it's one thing to pressure the Secretary of State of the United States of America. It seems quite something else to go after a high school principal. It shows depth. It shows systematization. It shows intent. Chinese Communist Party officials, too, are cultivating relationships with county school board members and local politicians, often through what are known as sister cities programs. Look, this Chinese competition is something you all know. It sits in the back of your mind, but you have many duties, and you are busy people. But this competition is well underway, and while these might seem like local matters to some, the cumulative effect is of enormous national importance and international significance.
Now, here's what I'm going to tell you from a world language teacher's perspective, or as we used to call ourselves, foreign language teachers. You know, I love people speaking more than one language, and in some ways, the United States is at a disadvantage because we don't have as many people speaking more than one language as many other countries do. It's nothing. When you go to Europe, it's very common to find people who know 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 languages. It's very common. However, here in the United States, a lot of people think I'm special because I know 3 languages. Well, you know, there are a lot of people who speak more languages than I do, and they're much more skilled at it than I am. So I don't think I'm that special, but I realize that I do have a skill that other people don't. Now, when it comes to what we're going to talk about, it does have to do with languages and language instruction because the Chinese government has found a way to infiltrate the United States without actually doing it. And what I mean by that is that they have figured out a way to indoctrinate our kids without actually making it obvious. Now, as a language teacher, I will tell you that one of the things that we were supposed to do and we enjoyed doing was culture. You know, we like to not only teach the language, but the culture, because languages and the culture that they represent really do have a lot in common. And sometimes in order to understand the language well, I mean to be fluent in it, you need to know some of the culture and how the language is used in that culture in order to really understand some of the nuances of the language. Well, this is what the Chinese government has done. They know, first of all, that having proficiency in another language is very important. Okay, they understand that. I mean, of course, they're very proud of Chinese, but they know that if you have a proficiency in English, you will have kind of a leg up on things. When you're going to another country, if you know their language, when it comes to especially business dealings, or if you're talking about inter-country relations, you actually have an advantage if you know the other language. When you see people come here from other countries, dignitaries and such, and they meet with President Trump, he's at a disadvantage if he doesn't know the language. Now, of course, he has an interpreter in his ear, but have you ever tried that? It's really distracting. And it would be even worse to be an interpreter. I could never do that. It has to be extremely stressful for people because, you know, you've got to be thinking one language and saying another. And, oh, I can't even imagine doing that. But there are people who are skilled at that. I've known a few, and I applaud them. But still, it puts the person at a disadvantage. And if you can speak the other language and you know what they're saying to you, that really gives you a leg up, especially in international relationships. So what China has done is actually a brilliant plan. They have created a way to indoctrinate American citizens, especially young ones who are in school, and all it does is it costs them a little bit of money, and they end up with people who are trained in English and know something about the American culture. Yeah, it really is brilliant. And they also can be used as a type of spy or, you know, get other information. So Pompeo is warning about this in this particular speech. And here's how the situation works. The Chinese government has a fund. They've created something called the Confucius Institute. And they're creating these little institutes all across the world, not just the United States, although the United States seems to be a big center of, you know, where they're locating them. They currently have, I think they said 500 and some, and they are hoping to end up with 1,000 by the end of 2020. So they're looking to increase it significantly. However, there has been a big movement in our Congress to say, this doesn't sound good. And there have been some studies that have been done. And here's the draw. You're probably wondering, how in the world do they do this? Well, the Chinese government goes to schools. They started with universities, and now they're moving down into K through 12. And what they would do is they would offer a Chinese teacher, someone who could teach people Chinese, and the university wouldn't have to pay hardly anything to have the person. Yeah, that's what they're doing. And especially in the K through 12 schools, I know my school right here near me, rural America, has one. And what they do is they pay for the entire teacher, so the school has them for nothing. Now, if you're a little public school and you've got a teacher that you have to pay $50,000 a year, but then the Chinese government comes in and they say, oh, you know what? We'll give you a teacher for free. Somebody will teach your students Chinese, and we'll give you all the materials to teach that too. So there aren't going to be any costs for the school, no supplies, no textbooks, nothing. Now, if you know anything about schools, there's always a constant thing about, we need money for this, we need money for that. And money is always an issue with public schools. So this is the plan. This is how they've been getting their Chinese people into these schools. Now, are they spies? Not necessarily, okay? But I will tell you that since the Chinese government is sponsoring them, they're picking people that are going to represent the Chinese government well, okay? They're not going to pick somebody who's going to talk bad about the Chinese government at all. They're going to choose people who are very pro-Chinese government. Okay, so that means that the people who come here, when they're talking about their country, they're going to talk about it in glowing terms. They're going to make China seem to be better than what it is. Okay, and now I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing. It's kind of inherent in us. Like if I went to another country to teach English, I tend to think I would probably make America sound wonderful. Of course, America is pretty good. But I don't think I would shy away from problems, if there are problems in our government or, different factions and things that have happened in the past. I wouldn't shy away from those. But when it comes to the Chinese government, yes, they are not allowed to talk about certain things. Especially any uprisings. Oh, and Taiwan. Ooh, they're not allowed really to talk about Taiwan and Tibet. So there are a lot of restrictions these people go through. It's not necessarily that they're probably told not to say those things. It's just that those are the people who are not going to say it. In this respect, they're giving a certain impression of the country that may not be true to what the country really is undergoing. Like, they're not going to tell these kids that women are not allowed to have children unless the government says they are, and then they're limited to how many they can have. And if a young woman gets pregnant and she's not married, then she must have an abortion. And so they're not going to tell the kids this. And as a teacher, I can understand that they do want to make their country sound great, but they're not going to be dealing with the problems. And so kids that are listening to this and are learning this language are going to have a skewed vision of what the country's like. And I'm not saying that it's a bad thing to hear good things about China. It's just there's a lot of problems there. There's a lot of human rights violations that need to be addressed. And, if you cannot address those as a teacher, then there is a problem. When I taught about France, I didn't just teach glowing reports about France. I gave a more balanced view. And yes, there are some issues. And especially with Hispanic countries, I didn't gloss over the problems that they have in Central America. And I gave a balanced approach to it and tried to let the students understand. And I will tell you that my textbooks, even in the United States, were very skewed. Not at the first, when I first started teaching, not so much. But near the end, the last time I adopted textbooks, I will tell you that there was a huge difference, and it was a big push toward a lot of the social justice stuff that you see now. Yeah, it really was frustrating. But anyway, so this is the situation that they have. The Chinese government has come in. They started with the universities, and now they're going down to K through 12 with these Confucius Institutes, so they can pretty much indoctrinate our kids about China, and at the same time they're learning the language, so that will give them a step up in things, because their people are going to know how to speak English fluently so they could survive here. And the schools are lapping it up here in the United States because they get this big bonus. They don't have to pay for the teacher, and they don't have to pay for the textbooks, and they're getting a lot of monies in for that. And that's an issue, too, that is addressed. Well, there is this report from the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, which is under Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs. And it is run by Senator Portman, and the ranking member is Carper. And they have this, believe it or not, a bipartisan report on Confucius Institutes at U.S. universities and K through 12 classrooms. This came out February 27th of 2019. But they have been investigating it for a while, because back here, this was in 2014, and there was a subcommittee hearing on, is academic freedom threatened by China's influence on U.S. universities? And so that was back in 2014 it was going on. Anyway, I want to just give you a little bit of information on this. Following an 8-month-long investigation today, and of course this is back in February a year ago, today U.S. Senators Rob Portman and Tom Carper, the chairman and ranking member of the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, unveiled a new bipartisan report that details the lack of transparency in how American colleges and universities manage Confucius Institutes, which are located at more than 100 American colleges and universities and have received more than $150 million in support from the Chinese government. These Confucius Institutes are controlled, funded, and mostly staffed by the Chinese government. The report also details China's one-sided treatment of U.S. schools and key State Department programs in China, and documents the lack of oversight by the Departments of State and Education of U.S. Confucius Institutes. Okay, so this is a little bit of the overview on it, and here is the actual report. By the way, this link right here, where is it? This link that's supposed to be the report doesn't work. So I did find it, though, fortunately, in another article. But this gives you an overview. The executive summary always does that. But this will tell you a little bit more of why Pompeo is concerned. When China sought to market itself to students around the world, it looked to its past. Confucius, the ancient Chinese philosopher, is synonymous with morality, justice, and honesty. The Chinese government capitalized on this rich legacy and began establishing Confucius Institutes on college campuses around the world in 2004, including the first in the United States at the University of Maryland. Today, there are more than 100 Confucius Institutes in the United States, the most of any country. And like I said, they have about 500 across the world. By the way, it's really ironic that the government is doing that, is using Confucius, because for quite a while, the communist government of China did not at all want to identify with Confucius. And so now that they're turning to him, it's just kind of funny. I think it's because people in the West had a very positive view of Confucius, and so they capitalized on that. But anyway, the Chinese government funds Confucius Institutes and provides Chinese teachers to teach language classes to students and non-student community members. In addition to Chinese language classes, Confucius Institutes host cultural events, including Chinese New Year celebrations, cooking classes, speakers, and dance and music performances. These selective events depict China as approachable and compassionate. Rarely are events critical or controversial. The Chinese government also funds and provides language instructors for Confucius Classrooms, which offer classes for kindergarten through 12th grade students. Confucius Classrooms are currently in 519 elementary, middle, and high schools in the United States. Yeah, that's where I had that number. Continued expansion of the program is a priority for China. Like I said, that was the number in 2019. In 2020, they want to make it 1,000. Confucius Institute funding comes with strings that can compromise academic freedom. The Chinese government approves all teachers, events, and speakers. Some U.S. schools contractually agree that both Chinese and U.S. laws will apply. The Chinese teachers sign contracts with the Chinese government, pledging they will not damage the national interests of China. Such limitations attempt to export China's censorship of political debate and prevent discussion of potentially politically sensitive topics. Indeed, U.S. school officials told the subcommittee that Confucius Institutes were not the place to discuss controversial topics like the independence of Taiwan or the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989. As one U.S. school administrator explained to the subcommittee, when something is, quote, funded by the Chinese government, you know what you're getting. Confucius Institutes exist as one part of China's broader long-term strategy. Through Confucius Institutes, the Chinese government is attempting to change the impression in the United States and around the world that China is an economic and security threat. Confucius Institute's soft power encourages complacency towards China's pervasive long-term initiatives against both government critics at home and businesses and academic institutions abroad. Those long-term initiatives include its Made in China 2025 plan, a push to lead the world in certain advanced technology manufacturing. The 1,000 Talents program is another state-run initiative designed to recruit Chinese researchers in the United States to return to China for significant financial gain, bringing with them the knowledge gained at U.S. universities and companies. So they're trying to get our top researchers that are Chinese. Yeah. Contracting with the Chinese government. The Chinese government runs the Confucius Institute program out of the Ministry of Education's Office of Chinese Language Council International, known as Hanban. Each U.S. school signs a contract with Hanban, establishing the terms of hosting a Confucius Institute. Contracts reviewed by the subcommittee generally contain provisions that state both Chinese and U.S. laws apply, limit public disclosure of the contract, and terminate the contract if the U.S. school takes actions that, quote, severely harm the image or reputation of the Confucius Institute. The Chinese director and teachers at each Confucius Institute also sign contracts with Hanban. The contract with Hanban makes clear a Chinese director or teacher will be terminated if they, quote, violate Chinese laws, quote, engage in activities detrimental to national interests, or, quote, participate in illegal organizations. In fact, the contract states the Chinese director and teachers must, quote, conscientiously safeguard national interests and report to the Chinese embassy within 1 month of arrival in the United States. Resources provided by Hanban, and this is where they get the schools. U.S. schools that contract with Hanban receive substantial funding and resources to establish the Confucius Institute on campus. At the outset, Hanban typically provides a U.S. school between $100,000 and $200,000 in startup costs, around 3,000 books and other materials. Hanban also selects and provides a Chinese director and teachers at no cost to the U.S. school. While school officials have the opportunity to interview candidates for these positions, there is little to no transparency into how the Chinese government selects the individuals that schools must choose from. And you can bet they're going to be like faithful to the party. You know, you're not going to pick people and send them over here that are kind of like Marie Yovanovitch sitting there as the ambassador of Ukraine, right? They're going to be people that are going to toe the party line. Nor did U.S. school officials interviewed by the subcommittee know if candidates would meet the school's hiring standards. Hanban requires director and teacher candidates to pass English proficiency tests and undergo a psychological exam to determine adaptability to living and teaching in the United States. Beyond that, U.S. schools' understanding of the selection process was limited at best. And so they are going now kindergarten through 12th grade. They started with colleges, and now they're going down there. The cost is, the investment by China in U.S. Confucius Institutes is substantial. Since 2006, the subcommittee determined China directly provided over $158 million in funding to U.S. schools for Confucius Institutes. A number of U.S. schools, however, failed to properly report this funding as required by law. So see, there's issues there because the schools are not telling that they're getting this money, and then they're getting probably U.S. federal money to fund the school too, so they're kind of double dipping on this. But anyway, that's the rest of it. The most important, and then there's visa failures that are issues as well, and China's lack of reciprocity, not giving us the same type of deal over there. So this is a significant issue, though, I think. And especially knowing when I first heard that this was happening, I thought, why would they bring somebody over? Because what happened in my town was that they had a French teacher who was very well known for building up his French program. He had a good, solid French program going. Of course, they had Spanish as well. And really, those two languages are probably the most important in the United States. With French, you may not know this, but they have about 15,000 words that have come over almost directly from the French language because, the French was the aristocracy many, many years ago, and then the French invaded England, and so the higher-ups in England all spoke French. And because of that, a lot of our upper-level words are French, like underwear, common language, the lower-level people, lingerie, the upper class. So a lot of upper class words that really are necessary if you want to do well on like the SAT or anything like that, they're going to be French, or they're going to at least have French roots. So it is a good language to learn, and especially if you live up, in Vermont or somewhere right along the, Quebec border, that's really good to know. But what happened was the school got this offer. And how can you refuse it? You had this teacher that you were probably paying because he'd been there for a while. So maybe $60,000, $70,000 a year. And all of a sudden you get everything paid for. Plus you get all the books paid for. And you get all the supplies and stuff. You get big time bucks. And I can just see the little dollar signs going off in their administration's eyes. I've seen it happen. And so sometimes some of those administrators will sell out if they have the right dollar sign proposed to them. They'll take whatever's there. So I think that's probably what happened. And the guy who had been the French teacher for so long was forced to retire early. And that was it. And there's no more French in the school. And now they have Chinese or Spanish. When I first heard it, I thought there's got to be some kind of catch. Well, that's the catch. That they're doing it because the Chinese government, it gives them a foothold into the education system in the United States. And see, this is the problem that we're having. And this was something that, we've been picking up with the George Soros thing where he was trying to put money into the local district attorney races so he could manipulate who was getting in there. Well, that's the same thing with the Chinese. They're getting this little indoctrination in there so they can manipulate how these young people perceive China. And that's going to be a huge factor in what happens with China. So I wanted to present this to you, and like I said, that is the actual report. It's 96 pages long, so you can go through that. And this is a hearing that they had on February 28th of 2019, and you can listen to that if you want to. It's about 2 hours long. But that was China's impact on the U.S. education system. Should they be impacting our education system? That's really the issue. That's what we should be talking about. And I had a couple other articles. This was one from August 21st of 2019. San Diego State University has shut down its Confucius Institute. And here's what one of the retired professors said. She's been hearing shocking reports about the CI, that's the Confucius Institutes, being used by China to silence freedom of speech on U.S. campuses, spreading communist propaganda, and even spying. So you do have to wonder, why is China spending billions educating our youth? We should indeed ask ourselves that question. It's very important. I'll leave the link to this. This is an Epoch Times article, and I'll leave that down below so you can see it. And even the Washington Post. This is a bipartisan issue, folks, because even the Washington Post is pointing it out, preventing Chinese espionage at America's universities. And this was May 22nd of 2018. So there you go. I'm going to leave the links down below. You can read more on it if you want to, but definitely watch the Pompeo video because very important stuff. It's a good video for you to watch. It's not real long, and he makes some good points about China. So that's what I've got for you on this one. I want to thank you for stopping by, and I'll see y'all later.